Hey everyone, welcome to Hello CSS, our third section, and we're going to be looking at everything that has to do with the style, the look, the feel, the design of a website. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. We'll have a look a little bit later at exactly what that means, but CSS is what we use whenever we want to control the design, the look, the feel of the web. If you remember from our first lesson in coding, we looked at the role that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript had to play. HTML, which we looked at in the last lesson, creates all of the elements on the page. So it creates our headings, our paragraphs, our links, our images, the sections and container elements on our page. CSS then is what styles them. So using CSS, we can target those individual elements, our headings, our paragraphs, our images, our links, and we can tell them how they should look. Now, we have to forget everything we learned in HTML. We've got a completely new syntax. So the structure that we write, the punctuation marks that we use, they're all different for CSS, but it's a pretty straightforward syntax. So what we have for each one is a selector, and the selector says, these are the elements that I want to target. These are the elements that I'm trying to style. Then we have a property that says what we're trying to style, and the value, what we want that style to be. So in this example, we are targeting all of our H1s, all of our level 1 headings, and we're making the color of them red. So this is the exact punctuation. You've got a set of curly brackets. You've got the element selector. We've got the property, a colon, the value, and a semicolon. And we'll repeat that for every line of CSS we write. So you may not know right off the top of your head exactly what to put. That's okay. Just have it next to you in your notes and it'll become familiar pretty quickly. We'll see this pattern repeated a lot in all of our CSS. Now let's look at some CSS properties. So some of the first things you will learn in CSS is the color and the background color. Now if we were to say H1 curly bracket color red, that's going to select all of our H1 headings and make them red. If we selected A curly bracket background color #FFF, you may or may not have seen hex codes before, but that designates a specific color. We're going to tell all of our links to have that background color. If we target our P element, we're targeting all the paragraphs and giving them a color of RGB 60, 70, 80, which is probably some shade of gray. Now we can use color names, we can use hex codes, and we can use RGB values. So whatever format you have your color in, you can use that in CSS. You may not know off the top of your head, what the hex code would be for colors, and you'll often find that the color names like red, blue, green, yellow are a pretty jarring, not very attractive version of that color. So this is a great resource for finding, pretty color palettes that will generate the hex codes or the RGB values for you. I've included a link in the resources, but it's called flatUIcolors.com. And it'll have a whole set of different palettes that you can choose from. You click on any of these colors and it'll automatically copy the hex code or the RGB value depending on what you have set. Okay, the next thing we might want to do is control the font size of all of our typography. Now, you're probably more familiar with creating fonts with pixels. That's what you would probably use in a Word editor that you're used to, or a text editor that you're used to using. But rems are best practice for a number of reasons, mainly around responsiveness, which we'll learn later. But you can use either, so whatever you are more comfortable with is fine. 1 rem equals around 16 pixels. Now, you can imagine it's probably going to get pretty cumbersome if we're writing a new selector for every single property or value that we want to set. So we can actually connect them together and have multiple CSS properties for one selector. So in this example, we've got our H1 selector. We're targeting all of our H1 elements, and we're giving two properties. We want to set the color to red and the background color to yellow. Now, the reason we put these on top of each other and we indent them in, that's not actually for the computer's benefit. The computer or the browser doesn't really care whether it's all one big long line or whether you've spaced it out correctly. The reason we do this is when you're troubleshooting your code, when instead of one or two lines of code, you've got hundreds of lines of code. This makes it really easy to scan from top to bottom, to see what you've written, and to understand if you're maybe missing a punctuation mark. Because if you forget one of these little semicolons, then the whole thing can break. So by putting them line by line and indenting them in, it just makes it really easy to stay organized and easy to read. And you'll thank yourself later on when you're going back and trying to find a mistake. Okay, we're going to have a whole lesson on negative space, on padding and margin and the difference between them, but I thought I'd just introduce it to you because I know it's something that everyone's a little bit excited to play with. Padding and margin are the two properties we have to create space around an element. So let's say this blue box is our element. That could be a paragraph, a heading, a link, anything. If we want to create space around the element, but part of its background color, so still part of the element itself, we use padding. If we want to create actual white space around the element outside of its border and background color, we use margin. And to do that, we're using that same syntax, padding, margin, and then the value. Now we could do this in pixels, we can do it in percentages, we can do it in rems. It just depends on your design, which one you're likely to want to use. Before we get to that, negative space. Okay, let's jump over into CodePen and we'll just test some of those properties out. So if we remember our HTML syntax, I can create a H1 heading. We'll say, hello world, very creative. And we'll create a paragraph. Okay, so we've got our HTML syntax, we've got our open tag and our close tag for each of our two elements. Now we want to style them in CSS. So I go over to my CSS, I put in my first selector. Let's target our H1 first. So I write H1, open curly bracket, and it'll automatically put in the close curly bracket for me. Enter to drop down a new line, and this is where I write my styles. So let's start with the first two things we learned, color and background color. I want to make my color red, and I want to make my background color yellow. Beautiful. Now let's play with the size of the font. Let's say 16 pixels. Pretty small. So we can experiment. Often we don't know what size we want it to be and we'll just play with it. Let's have a look at what rems look like. So one rem is about the size of what your paragraph font would usually be. And then you can go up from there. 1.5 rem, 2 rem, 3 rem, 4 rem, etc. Let's say we want quite a big heading. We can leave it at maybe 2.5 rem. Now let's have a look at the difference between the padding and the margin. Now before we do, I'm just going to get rid of all the browser styles. So by default, browsers put in some basic styles. See how before we had anything, I can just delete this for a second. Before we had anything, our H1 is already bigger than our paragraph. That's because the browser by default sets certain styles. It says that headings need some margin above and below them. It says that headings should be bigger than paragraphs. It says that links should be blue and underlined. Those are kind of our default browser styles. So when we're coding, often we want to eliminate some of those default browser styles so that we can really see clearly what we have created. Now this little star here is our universal selector, and that selects every element. So we're going to use that to set margin to 0 and padding to 0, and we can see what difference that made right away. All that space around them has disappeared, and that's helpful because now we're starting from 0 literally. We can experiment with the padding and margin and see exactly what they'll do. So let's go back to our H1 and set padding 1 rem and see what it does. Now we've added space in here around the element, exactly 1 rem worth. Now let's see what would happen if this was margin instead. So it's the exact same amount of space. The element is still the same amount of space around the core element, but when it's margin, it's outside of the background color or border. When it's padding, it's inside. Now you probably wouldn't be able to tell if we didn't have this background color because that's what's showing us where the element starts and finishes, but it's still good to know regardless because you want to kind of code in a way that prepares for whatever your ultimate design will be. So with padding and margin, we just think about, do we want it to be inside the background color or do we want it to be outside the background color? Now let's style our paragraph a little bit. Maybe we have a font size of 1 rem or 1.3 maybe, make it a little bit bigger. Maybe we've got a background color of teal. We've got lots of really attractive colors. Maybe a color of white and some padding. Now, if we wanted to add space between the two of these, we would add margin, and we could add margin to either one. Let's add it to both. Maybe we'll do this one in percentage. Now, can you have a guess what the difference is between using rems for our padding or margin and using percentages? Let's make this a little bigger so that we can see. Maybe even 10%. Now watch what happens as I move the browser. Can you see how the space around it is shrinking? When it's over here, we've got this much space. When the browser is really small, that space has shrunk. So when we use percentages for our padding and margin, they're responsive. They're adapting to the width of the screen. When we use rems, they stay the same. This size, let's make it a little bit bigger so you can see. Whoops, that's not what we want. Let's make it almost the same size. Okay, so they look the same at first. Our H1 has margin in rems, this is 4 rems, and our paragraph has margin in percentage. Now watch what happens as it changes. See how this one shrinks as the page gets smaller and this one stays the same size. Okay, let's jump back over to our slides and see what's next. Now, so far we've learned how to target individual elements, but if we wanted to target the whole page, let's say we wanted to give a background color, or we wanted to align all the text, or we wanted to just create space around all of the elements, we can use the body element. Now, the body element is technically wrapped around all of these guys, but in CodePen, it hides it because we don't, just to make it quicker and easier to start a new coding project, it has already created that body element and wrapped everything inside. So let's get rid of all of these styles. And let's see what happens if we target the body. If we give, say, padding 5%. Now the whole page has moved in 5%. Now let's maybe align the text. And change the color. So by targeting the body, we can target all of the elements on the page. I'm guessing you can see from looking at these examples why having a resource like Flat UI Colors is so valuable, because when you just type in the words for the color names, they're pretty jarring shades. So the body element, just to refresh, targets the whole page and everything in it. Okay, that's the end of our Intro to CSS lesson. Over the next 8 days, we're going to be covering lots more CSS. We'll be looking more in depth at how to style typography, how to create different layouts. But first, take some time to practice and get a bit of a handle on the basics. So this is the challenge I want you to do. Open up your own CodePen, create 6 HTML elements. So that could be headings, paragraphs, links. Use CSS to give each one a different color and a different background color. And I recommend practicing not just with color names, but also using hex codes and RGB values. Then I want you to give each one a different background color. I want you to style the whole page, the body, give that another background color, and maybe have a go of changing the text alignment. And then change the font size of at least 3 elements using rems. It's one thing to learn about typography measurements like rems hypothetically, but to actually get a feel for them, you really need to practice. Now, you can use any colors you want. It doesn't matter if it's ugly. It just matters that you're getting used to the syntax. So you'll create something like this. Good luck. Jump into the Facebook community and let us know how you go. We'd love to hear all about what you think of